It's April 7th, 1978, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
Today in history in 1978, Betty Ford felt that she had finally kicked her prescription pill habit, which she later referred to as her sobriety birthday. And while it came after a familial intervention, this was a very private milestone, a personal triumph in an otherwise very public life.
Yes, 6 days before this, Betty had walked into the living room of her home in Rancho Mirage in California to see her husband, Gerald, until recently the president, their 4 adult children, Mike, Jack, Steve and Susan, and Dr. Persh, who was a US Navy doctor specialising in addiction. Gerald had been the first to speak. He said, "We're all here because we love you," which I think today gives huge is this an intervention vibes? But I don't think interventions were as in the cultural imagination then. So she was quite taken aback by this. I imagine, this wasn't the kind of thing that the average 1970s family was declaring to one another in their living rooms. And then the children took turns describing how her addiction had impacted them through their lives. Jack told her that as a kid, he was always peeking around the corner into the family room to see what shape you were in, things that would really hurt a mother to hear. And initially, Betty was angry and in denial. She didn't have a problem, but by the end of what ended up being a 2-hour sit down, she did start to recognise that she had a problem. And it was 6 days later that she just finally gave up the prescription pills that had prompted the intervention.
Yes, because it was the combination of prescription pills and alcohol which did for Betty Ford. Obviously, now we know the name Betty Ford and can sometimes, I think, even forget that she was the First Lady of the United States because you know it more from the Betty Ford Recovery Center. But then she was, of course, an absolute pillar of the Republican establishment. She'd been First Lady, but also a really popular one. Gerald Ford had lost the last election, but there were badges in the 76 election which said Betty's husband for president, because she was known for being kind of open-minded, and in her responses to questions she'd say what she really thought should happen rather than perhaps what she should say as the First Lady. And so the drugs that she was taking, she had Darvon prescribed for the pain that she had, having trapped a nerve, having opened a window, and Valium for the anxiety, and she drank cocktails every night, 2 a night, 3 a night. But actually, none of that would have been weird for people in those kinds of circles with top-level doctors around them. So for her to recognise that these things she'd been told to do by a doctor were causing her family to feel she wasn't the same person anymore, she was slurring her words, she was messing up her public appearances, would have been really, really hard to hear.
Yeah, and after a 2-hour intervention, Betty agreed to seek treatment. And, I think the interesting thing about Betty Ford was that she displayed the same frankness about her condition with the rest of the frankness that she approached her position as the First Lady. In a time where First Ladies were regarded as the people who gave teas and cut ribbons, Ford weighed in on huge stuff like abortion and the Equal Rights Amendment, and she shared her breast cancer diagnosis and her mastectomy with the public. She also, had this then very public outing of her addiction issues, and it had started, as you say, with this pinched nerve in her back that got her addicted to painkillers. She could have just handled it internally and done a very private thing, but she went public with it really very quickly.
Yeah, she said that she was going into rehab for prescription pill addiction. And again, this was something that was extremely taboo. Even if she hadn't been the recently departed First Lady, it would have been shocking because addiction was still seen as this dirty secret, especially for families of wealth and status like the Fords. And then she followed up that statement 10 days later with a second one in which she disclosed even more. She was so transparent. She said, "I have found I'm not only addicted to the medication I've been taking for my arthritis, but also to alcohol." And as you were alluding to, Ollie, among well-off people in the 70s, it wasn't unusual to be drinking multiple cocktails a night, and it wasn't unusual even to be mixing them with prescription pills. But she realised that it had got to an extent that it was seriously affecting her, and she, I think, had known subconsciously probably for a while, because her father had been an alcoholic, and when she was 16 he died of carbon monoxide poisoning in the family garage while working on the car. And actually he died the day before his 60th birthday, and Betty entered rehab the day before her 60th birthday. So there was kind of a cyclical thing there. Her brother was also an alcoholic, her first husband was an alcoholic, and I think that was part of her appeal too, was that she was like seen as this first lady for the 1970s, as you said, very plain spoken, liked to weigh in on the issues of the day, an open feminist. Even, the Republican Party was so different then, because both she and Gerald Ford were pro-choice. So, it was a different context, but she was very open, and she had been married before. Like when she had met Gerald Ford, she was in the process of divorcing her first husband. It was funny, she was just like this perfect representation of how America was changing. She was having all of these same issues in her life that ordinary Americans were having. Same with the breast cancer diagnosis. I mean, she was diagnosed a few weeks after she entered the White House. And this was time when breast cancer particularly, and cancer in general, was seen as very taboo. So she'd just gone through all these things that ordinary people could relate to. And when she released these statements from rehab, it was a risk because she was sharing so much. But people responded, this huge outpouring of affection. It didn't impact her popularity at all, because once again, she was just reflecting these really real gritty issues that lots of American families were dealing with and feeling shame over them.
And I actually think it did really help as well that she was a Republican. I think if this had been a Democrat first lady, it would have been easy for conservatives to point and say, look, this is where liberalness leads you. But because the Fords were these big blue chip conservative names, and as you say, yes, this was obviously way pre-Tea Party Republicanism and MAGA, but nonetheless, she sort of put her name to flamboyantly progressive causes, given the context that she's a Republican First Lady. She'd already done this sort of infamous interview on 60 Minutes in which she said that her children had probably tried marijuana and they'd probably had extramarital sex, and she wouldn't be surprised and it was perfectly normal if that were the case. So that, after Nixon was a big old shift. And I think the fact that she was nonetheless a Ford meant that everyone was prepared to give her the benefit of the doubt and to find out about the rehab process for the first time. She was at the Alcohol Rehabilitation Service of the Navy's Long Beach Regional Medical Center. You think about the Betty Ford treatment centers, you think about celebrities in Bel Air and places like that. This was not that. She wasn't at a spa. This would have been a difficult medical process.
Yeah, but also it propelled her into the position where she was not only ready to start up her own facility, but also she was the right person for it. The nation had really gone through this entire journey with her. And by the time she set up the Betty Ford Center in 1982, her struggle was really very well known. And at a time when substance abuse was hugely stigmatized, even her having gone through the process was an enormous thing for the nation. But then to start up this center herself, and she partnered with medical professionals, including a guy called Dr. James West, who was a recovering alcoholic himself and was also a pioneer in addiction treatment. They came up with this new form of substance abuse treatment that was all about trying to combine clinical expertise with empathy and with accessibility, kind of resting on recovery movements and 12-step programs that were happening anyway, but it incorporated all of those in a new and hugely empathetic way.
Yeah, the treatment model was based on one that was pioneered by the Hazelden Foundation in Minnesota in 1949. And it was really revolutionary at that time because addicts generally ended up in jails or mental asylums in the 1940s. And this was this, the non-judgmental, very patient-centered, treating addiction as a disease rather than as a moral failing. And those are the principles that were adopted for the Betty Ford Clinic as well. But Betty was, although very keen to work on the project, she was actually reluctant to associate her name with it, not because of the shame of being associated with addiction, but because of the damage it might cause if she were ever to relapse in the future. She was very, very conscious of the impact that could have. In actuality, she never did, but it just goes to show that she was really seriously considering what she could be doing with her profile and not doing anything that could actually set the movement back.
The initial branch was in Rancho Mirage, Palm Springs, where she'd lived after leaving the White House, and she would guest lecture the patients once per month, and she would introduce herself in the classic way, I'm Betty Ford, and I'm an alcoholic. And although it was high status because it was the Betty Ford Rehab Centre. It was down to earth. Again, you sort of think about celeb rehab joints now, and they are kind of like 5-star hotels. But this wasn't. It was more comfortable than what the Navy was offering, but it was about seriously coming to terms with addiction.
And also, it wasn't just a thing where you go to the centre, you do your period of detoxification, and then you're kicked out. It had this holistic approach that extended to aftercare with the support network of like alumni programs that were designed to sustain this long-term recovery. But I think that then the arrival of big names to the clinic did help to propel it yet further in the public consciousness. People like Elizabeth Taylor, Johnny Cash, Lindsay Lohan, Keith Urban more recently. You know, these names...
A mixed bag of success, I think we can conclude there.
Sure, yeah. But also they all acknowledged what the Betty Ford Centre said, which was that, you know, you don't get over it. You just learn to
you're not cured.
Manage it, yes. And so I think that was hugely important for people's understanding as well.
Yeah, and I think, like, researching this episode, it just became about, wow, Betty Ford was just such an amazing, cool person.
Cool.
Like, so many amazing things about her. Like, she was a dancer. This had actually been mildly controversial when they first got married, was that she was a professional dancer. And she was, doing this tour of the White House on her last day. And the photographer just got this picture of her. She's like leapt up onto the table and she's sort of posing on it, off this table, which has been surrounded by men historically. And she was just standing in the middle of it. It was very, very cool. It was, and I'm just surprised that, like, it's a bit depressing, really, isn't it, to think about how much attitudes have actually changed in the States. Like, she was extremely popular on both sides of the political aisle, and the fact that she was outspokenly pro-abortion didn't seem to make her less popular with the Republican base.
Although, as we've been saying, to be fair, everybody was on Valium.
You've got to see everything through that lens, yes.
Tomorrow.
The two people that this book influenced the most in ways that changed all our lives are David Cameron and Barack Obama.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.